If you're watching this video while eating, or just after finishing a meal, you've probably never had to ask what seems like a very simple question. Where did this meal come from? Not in the general sense, from the supermarket, from a store, or ordered through an app, but rather, who decided that there would be food today? Who stored it? And since when? And what would happen if tomorrow there were nothing left to eat? In the modern world, food appears before us as something almost self-evident. It is regular, stable, and seemingly unlimited in choice. If one dish is missing, we replace it with another. If we lack time, we buy something ready-made. If we don't want to cook, we order delivery. The system behind our meals has become so invisible that we rarely recognize how completely we depend on it. But for most of human history, especially in the Middle Ages, food was never self-evident. Because daily life unfolded in a world where eating or not eating was the real boundary between continued existence and disappearance. There were no refrigerators to extend time, no supply chains to compensate for mistakes, no concept of buying more tomorrow, and no idea of eating according to preference. Every meal was the result of calculations made months, sometimes years, earlier. A single wrong decision in autumn could become a silent death in winter. A food store that ran out too early was not an inconvenience. It was the end of a family. What matters is this. Medieval people understood this very clearly. They did not see food as a background element of everyday life, but as the central axis around which survival revolved. Work schedules followed the agricultural calendar. Family relationships were shaped by the distribution of rations. Festivals, religious rituals, even social morality, all were directly or indirectly tied to the same question. What will we eat, and how long can we keep eating? When we talk about medieval food, it is easy to fall into two familiar traps. The first is romanticization, imagining simple, natural meals, people living close to the land, slow lives in harmony with nature. A beautiful image, but largely a modern projection, created by those who have never faced a winter where hunger was a certainty, not a distant possibility. The second trap is contempt, seeing the medieval diet as poor, deficient, unhygienic, and crude, comparing it directly with modern nutritional standards and quickly concluding that it was a backward model that deserved to be replaced. Both perspectives miss what matters most. Medieval people did not build their food systems to live comfortably. They built them to survive as long as possible in a world that offered very little mercy. And precisely because of that, those systems, however harsh, however limited, were internally consistent, logical, and durable in their own way. This video does not try to recreate medieval life, nor does it aim to judge the past by modern standards. Instead, it asks a different question. How is it possible that in a world without preservation technology, millions of families manage to sustain life across centuries of instability? Because only when we understand that food was once never guaranteed can we begin to confront a more uncomfortable but necessary question. In today's world, where food is always available, what have we traded away to achieve that convenience? Eating by the seasons. If there is one common misunderstanding when looking back at the medieval diet, it is the assumption that people chose to eat seasonally. In reality, there was no choice. Eating by the seasons was not a philosophy of life, not an ecological awakening, and not a romantic desire to return to nature. It was a condition of existence, a rigid, inflexible structure imposed directly by the environment, the climate, and an almost complete absence of long-term storage. In that world, nature did not merely provide food. Nature dictated the rhythm of eating, the timing of meals, and the limits of consumption itself. For a medieval household, the year did not begin in January or end in December. The year was divided by far more practical questions. When is fresh food available? When do we have to rely on stored supplies? When does the granary become dangerous? Food did not appear evenly, day by day or week by week. It arrived in narrow, highly specific windows, and often could not be extended. A single vegetable might only be edible for a few weeks. One successful harvest could determine a family's survival for the next 12 months. And one small mistake, planting too late, harvesting too slowly, drying grain improperly, could become an irreversible disaster once winter arrives. Because of this, a medieval year was not imagined as a smooth, circular cycle of time, but as a downward slope of provisions. The year began with hope, peaked at harvest, and then slowly declined toward its lowest point, often in late winter or early spring of the following year. The question was not, what do we eat today? But rather, if we eat like this, how long can we last? Spring, contrary to modern intuition, was often the most dangerous season. In many rural European records, spring is referred to as the hungry gap. Supplies from the previous year were nearly exhausted. Stored grain had been rationed month by month throughout winter. New crops were not yet ready for harvest. Livestock that survived the cold months were weak and produced little milk. This was the period when families deliberately reduced their rations, not because they were careless, but because they understood with precision that eating more today might mean not eating at all next month. Decisions made during this time were rarely emotional. They were mathematical. The remaining flour was divided by the estimated number of days until the earliest possible harvest. Meat, if any remained, was reserved for moments of highest physical demand. People did not eat first and worry later, because later was a clearly defined point, and it was very close. Summer brought a degree of relief. Green vegetables returned. Eggs and dairy became more available. Freshwater fish could supplement the diet. But summer was not a season of abundance. Most summer foods could not be preserved for long. Eating more at this stage did nothing to solve the problem of winter. Summer was used primarily to sustain labor, to partially restore bodies weakened by spring scarcity, and to prepare for the most critical phase of all, autumn. Autumn was the moment when the entire survival system went into full operation. Harvesting was not simply agricultural work. It was a race against time. Grain had to be cut at the right moment, dried thoroughly, and milled carefully. Fruit had to be sorted, some eaten fresh, others preserved. Root vegetables had to be processed quickly before the cold set in. There was no second attempt. Mistakes made in autumn were not merely economic losses, they were existential risks. Manorial records from the medieval period show that during this time, Nearly the entire community was mobilized. Children, the elderly, women, everyone had a role. Not because of abstract ideas of collective spirit, but because if the work was not done fast enough or carefully enough, the consequences spared no one. Then winter arrived, not as a surprise, but as a calculated phase. Winter offered few options. Food was judged by a single criterion: would it last? Hard bread, grain porridge, salted meat, smoked foods, fermented vegetables. These were all the results of decisions made months earlier. Nothing was fresh, and no one expected freshness. Expectations had long since been adjusted. The repetition of this cycle over generations forced human bodies to adapt. Medieval people did not live in a state of stable energy intake. They were accustomed to periods of relative sufficiency, followed by long stretches of caloric deficit. This was not considered pathological. It was normal. Hunger, therefore, did not carry the same sense of urgency it does in modern societies. It did not automatically demand immediate action. People learned to endure, to delay, and most importantly, to distinguish between dangerous hunger and acceptable hunger. Eating was no longer a reflex, but a decision made within a long-term framework. This produced a fundamentally different relationship with food. People did not eat because they were bored, sad, or inconvenienced. They ate because it was time to eat, and because doing so would not disrupt the broader plan of survival. Food was not comforting. It was functional. When the rhythm of eating was entirely governed by the seasons, social life followed the same logic. Work schedules, rest periods, and even religious rituals revolved around food cycles. Many fasting periods aligned strikingly well with times of natural scarcity. In this context, abstinence was not only spiritual, it also legitimized an unavoidable reality. Major festivals tended to occur after the harvest, when anxiety about food was temporarily eased. It is no coincidence that these were the moments when communities allowed themselves to eat more and drink more. These were rare intervals when the system permitted relaxation. From a modern perspective, eating seasonally is often framed as an ethical, health-driven, or sustainable choice. In the medieval world, it was the direct result of a lack of control. Nature decided when people could eat, how much they could eat, and for how long. The greatest difference between past and present lies not in the types of food consumed, but in who controlled the rhythm of eating. The modern world seeks to make nature serve human needs. The medieval world required humans to submit to nature's rhythm, and within that submission, a tightly structured system emerged, a system in which every meal was shaped by time, discipline, and the memory of past famines. When food no longer appeared on demand, people were forced to find ways to extend its life beyond its natural limits. What began as instinct gradually became technique, then tradition, methods designed to preserve what was most precious just a little longer, long enough to survive the next winter. Food preservation. When the seasons no longer worked in humanity's favor, the question ceased to be what to eat today, and became how to prevent what already existed from disappearing too soon. In the medieval world, the greatest enemy of food was not hunger, but time. Time spoiled meat, wilted vegetables, molded grain, and ultimately pushed people into a state where no choices remained. There were no refrigerators to slow this process, no chemical preservatives to delay decay, and no concept of consume quickly and restock. Once the harvest season ended, whatever had been gathered defined the entire margin of survival for the months ahead. In this context, medieval people did not preserve food in the modern sense. They transformed it into something else, into a state that was less appealing, less flexible but more enduring. Food was no longer treated as something to be enjoyed. It was something that had to be kept alive. Fresh meat was, by nature, a short-term resource. But once salted or smoked, it became a form of strategic reserve. Salt, therefore, was not merely a seasoning. In many medieval societies, it was a survival resource. Traded, taxed, and tightly controlled, salting meat was not meant to improve its taste. The sole objective was to remove moisture, slow microbial activity, and extend edibility by weeks or months, sometimes just long enough to outlast the winter. Smoking complemented salting, not for flavor, but to further dry the surface of food and create conditions hostile to bacterial growth. Smokehouses and soot-filled kitchens were not cultural symbols. They were life-preserving tools. Smoked meat could be hard, overly salty, and difficult to eat, but it endured. And in the medieval world, endurance mattered more than comfort. Fish, especially freshwater fish and coastal marine species, was treated according to the same logic. Dried and salted fish became stable protein sources during months when fishing was impossible. Many records show that in monasteries and religious communities, preserved fish played a critical role during fasting periods, when meat was restricted but caloric needs remained unchanged. Grain, the foundation of the medieval diet, was also not stored passively. It had to be thoroughly dried and protected from moisture, rodents, and insects. A granary was not simply a storage space, it was a system of constant surveillance. Moldy or damaged grain had to be removed quickly, because a single failure could ruin the entire supply. Flour, once milled, spoiled faster than whole grain, which explains why many households ground grain in small batches, accepting extra labor in exchange for reduced risk. Vegetables that could not be eaten fresh were fermented or pickled. Cabbage, turnips, cucumbers. These were not only preserved to extend their lifespan, but to alter their biological properties. Medieval people did not understand bacteria in modern scientific terms, but through accumulated experience they knew that sour foods were often safer, easier to digest, and less likely to cause illness during winter. This was empirical science, not written in formulas, but stored in generational memory. Another important but less frequently discussed method was preservation in fat. Cooked meat was submerged in animal fat, creating an airtight barrier. The result was not a desirable dish, but a food that could survive without refrigeration. Each of these techniques involved a trade-off. Flavor, texture, and sometimes nutritional value were sacrificed in exchange for time. What is striking is that within this entire system, there was no concept of ideal food. There was only food appropriate to a given phase. What was considered enjoyable in summer could become a liability in winter. What seemed barely edible in times of abundance could become the difference between survival and starvation when no alternatives remained. These preservation techniques did not exist in isolation. They were inseparable from consumption discipline. Preserved food was not used casually. It was rationed according to rhythm, projection, and scarcity. Eating salted meat too early could weaken future endurance. Holding it too long risked spoilage. Using preserved food was therefore a continuous balancing act. This required a form of thinking that the modern world rarely demands: long-term planning under uncertainty. No one knew exactly how long winter would last. No one could guarantee the next harvest. Yet decisions still had to be made, daily, at every meal. Here, food preservation was not merely a technical process, it was a dialogue with time. Humans could not stop time, but they could slow its effects. They could not create new food in winter, but they could extend the existence of what they already had. Compared to the present, where food preservation serves convenience and choice, the medieval objective was entirely different. The goal was not to preserve the original experience, but to preserve the possibility of survival. Food was allowed to change, as long as it did not disappear. And through this process, a distinctive relationship formed between people and what they ate. There was a clear understanding of what was eaten because it was needed, and what was eaten because it still existed. Each time a granary was opened, each time a piece of salted meat or a barrel of fermented vegetables was taken out, it served as a quiet reminder. Time was still passing, and reserves did not replenish themselves. Once food had been transformed into a longer-lasting state, the next question was no longer how to keep it, but who would eat how much and when. Because in a system where time had been temporarily restrained, distribution became the decisive factor in whether that extension would be enough for everyone to make it through. Ration distribution. Once food had been made to last, through salt, smoke, fermentation, and the darkness of underground storage, another problem emerged immediately, no less severe. Not everyone could eat the same. At this point, a common modern misunderstanding needs to be addressed directly. Rationing within medieval households was not based on emotion or abstract moral principles. It followed a cold, pragmatic logic. Energy had to be allocated to those positions most capable of sustaining the survival of the household as a whole. In this context, food was no longer food in the everyday sense. It was calories, and calories were a finite resource, one whose depletion could be estimated, but which could not be replenished during winter. A medieval household functioned like a closed biological system. If energy was distributed incorrectly, the system did not become inefficient, it collapsed. Heavy laborers, most often adult men, ate more not because they were favored, but because they generated indirect energy for everyone else. They plowed fields, cut firewood, repaired buildings, and transported produce. If they became physically depleted, the entire chain of survival downstream would break. A man too weak to work during planting season was not merely an individual in decline. He represented a threatened harvest. Women, despite carrying workloads no less demanding, generally ate less, not because their labor was lighter, but because the system assessed energy expenditure differently. Domestic labor, child care, and food preparation were continuous and exhausting, but they did not require short bursts of high caloric output in the same way as field labor. This distribution did not reflect human worth. It reflected how the system optimized energy flow. Children ate simpler food, less meat, more porridge and bread. Not because they needed less, but because children's bodies could tolerate short-term scarcity better. And because investing calories in children only made sense if the household itself was likely to survive long enough for them to reach adulthood. This is an uncomfortable reality, but a practical one. Not every investment was prioritized when resources approached exhaustion. The elderly, once no longer capable of heavy labor, were often shifted to softer, lower-energy foods. This did not mean they were abandoned. It reflected a biological reality that medieval societies were forced to acknowledge. When resources are finite, the system must prioritize the components that can sustain it. Crucially, all of this was considered normal. There was no moral debate at every meal, no sense of injustice in the modern sense. Everyone understood that if distribution failed, the consequences would not fall on one person, but on everyone. Meals, therefore, were not moments of unconditional relaxation. They were moments when survival decisions were enacted, where one sat, who was served first, who received which portion. Everything conveyed information. No written rules were needed, no formal laws. The order was maintained through collective memory of times when the system had nearly failed. In many households, women and children ate later. Not because they mattered less, but because this was a method of risk control. If food ran short, heavy laborers had to be secured first. This is a logic that modern societies, built on surplus, find difficult to accept. In the medieval context, it was a condition for collective survival. The key point is this: no one ate according to individual need. That concept barely existed. People ate according to role, and roles shifted with season, age, and health. When someone falls ill, their ration might temporarily increase. When someone no longer contributed labor, their portion gradually decreased. This was not punishment. It was a system adjustment. This mode of distribution also produced a very different relationship with satiety. Being full was not the default state. Fullness was a marker of rare periods, usually just after harvest. Most of the time, the standard was enough to continue. This blurred the line between hunger and fullness in ways modern people rarely experience. Compared to the present, where eating is maximally individualized, with separate portions, diets, and schedules, the medieval system operated on the opposite principle. The more individualized consumption became, the more fragile the system grew. Each personal preference consumed part of the shared safety margin. This is why communal eating, sharing one pot, one dish, was not merely tradition. It was a distribution control mechanism. When everyone ate together, no one could guac more than their share without being noticed. That transparency was not meant to foster emotional bonding, but to prevent distortion in energy allocation. Over time, this order became invisible. No reminders were needed. No arguments arose. It was absorbed into daily life as simply how things work. And people did not ask why they ate less today. They asked whether eating this way would be enough for tomorrow. Here, a paradox appears. While modern societies treat eating enough, according to personal needs, as a sign of progress, Medieval societies treated the ability to eat less than one's needs as a survival skill. This was not asceticism. It was an adaptation. When food had been extended through technique and distributed through discipline, the system was still not complete. Even the most rational allocation would fail if consumption escaped oversight. That is why meals were never purely biological acts. They took place in shared spaces, under the gaze of others, where eating was no longer private behavior, but an act with social consequences. And from this, another form of organization gradually emerged, one in which eating was regulated not only by ration size, but by the simple fact that people ate together. Communal meals, once rations had been calculated and calories allocated according to role, one final variable remained, one capable of collapsing the entire system: how people actually ate. Not how much was assigned on paper, but how consumption unfolded in everyday life. In medieval society, this was not a minor detail. A single individual consuming beyond the shared rhythm could quietly destabilize the entire fragile balance before anyone noticed. It was within this context that communal meals emerged, not as an emotionally driven tradition, but as a management solution. Eating together, in the same space from the same pot, was not meant to create familial warmth in a romantic sense. Its purpose was to make consumption visible. When people gathered around a shared source of food, individual intake was no longer private. It existed within the sight of others. That visibility created a silent but highly effective mechanism of control. In many medieval households, there were no individual plates in the modern sense. Food was placed at the center, and each person took their portion from it. This practice did more than reduce the need for utensils. It made overconsumption far more difficult. Any imbalance became immediately noticeable, without reminders, without written rules. More importantly, communal meals synchronized the rhythm of consumption. Everyone began eating at the same time. Everyone finished at the same time. There was no concept of casual snacking. No opportunity for someone to quietly eat extra during the day without leaving a trace. In a system where reserves were calculated with precision, controlling the timing of eating was as critical as controlling portion size. Here, eating ceased to be a purely biological act. It became a disciplined social behavior. The fact that many medieval communities ate only 1 or 2 meals per day was not due to ignorance of nutrition. It followed the same logic. Fewer meals meant fewer openings of storage, fewer opportunities to exceed planned consumption, fewer small exceptions, which in survival systems often accumulate into major failures. Communal meals also functioned as continuous checkpoints. Through the way people ate, households could observe who was weakening, who ate more slowly, who no longer had sufficient strength. These signs did not require measurement. They emerged naturally in shared space, and small adjustments could be made early before problems became irreversible. In monasteries and larger communal settings, this principle was pushed to its extreme. The refectory, where everyone ate the same food in the same quantity, reflected not only religious ideals, but an extraordinarily efficient distribution system. When everyone ate the same thing at the same time, the space for disparity was nearly eliminated. Notably, in this context, The lack of privacy in eating was not seen as intrusive. It was understood as necessary. Eating was an act with consequences, and actions with consequences could not be entirely private. Compared to the modern world, where eating is maximally individualized, with personal schedules, portions, and spaces, medieval communal meals appear harsh. But in that world, personalization was not a sign of freedom. It was a source of risk. The more unobserved consumption occurred, the harder the system was to control. And in a system with no buffer for error, transparency mattered more than comfort. Communal meals also produced a critical psychological effect. They made each individual acutely aware that their portion was directly connected to the portions of others. Eating faster or eating more did not affect only oneself, it affected the entire group. This interdependence did not need to be taught. It was felt daily, in the amount of food left in the pot. This created a form of discipline without coercion. No one needed to enforce rules. No one needed to assign punishment. The presence of others and the memory of past famines was sufficient to regulate behavior. Over time, communal meals ceased to be perceived as a mechanism. They became simply how things are done. Children grew up in this environment and learned to eat in sync long before they understood why. Adults maintained the practice not because of tradition, but because they knew precisely what would happen if this order broke down. One point is often overlooked from a modern perspective. Communal meals were not designed to create absolute equality. They were designed to create stability. Portions could still differ. Roles were still distinct. But the act of eating itself was placed within a shared framework, ensuring that all differences remained visible and controllable. When food had been extended through technique, distributed through calculation, and consumed in shared space, the medieval survival system reached a remarkable level of completeness. There was no modern technology, no data, no precise forecasting, only accumulated experience, collective discipline, and a clear understanding that eating was a matter of survival, not personal preference. And it was precisely when meals became such tightly regulated collective acts that the medieval household revealed its true function. Not merely as shelter, not merely as a unit of kinship, but as a fully integrated management system, one in which production, storage, distribution, and consumption were bound into a closed loop where every decision, no matter how small, left its mark on the survival of the entire group. The medieval household, when we step back and consider everything that came before, seasonal eating, food preservation, ration allocation, and communal meals, one conclusion becomes increasingly clear. The medieval household did not exist as a unit of consumption. It existed as a closed management system in which every decision was directly tied to the question of near-term survival. In the modern world, the family is understood primarily as a place of residence, rest, and recovery for the next working day. Most critical functions have been externalized. Production happens in factories. Storage takes place in industrial warehouses. Distribution is handled by markets. Risk is absorbed by long, complex supply chains. The household has become the endpoint of that flow. In medieval society, the household was the entire system. It was simultaneously a site of food production, a storage facility, a risk assessment unit, and the place where life-critical decisions were executed. all compressed into a small space with limited resources and no external safety net when mistakes occurred. This created a mode of thinking that the modern world rarely needs to sustain: total responsibility. There was no concept of system failure external to the household. If stores ran out too early, there was no authority to appeal to. If winter lasted longer than expected, there was no supplemental supply. If a poor decision was made in autumn, its consequences became visible in January or February, when it was already too late to correct. For this reason, the household was forced to function as a forecasting unit. Not forecasting based on statistical data, but on collective memory. How long previous winters had lasted, which years had brought crop failure, which weather patterns had preceded disaster. This knowledge was not written in ledgers or manuals. It was transmitted through stories, habits, and practices, things no one explained, but everyone followed. For example, the practice of keeping a portion of food untouched until very late in winter was not superstition. It was a safety strategy, born from the understanding that all predictions can fail and that a margin must always exist for conditions worse than expected. In this sense, the household operated like a system with built-in buffers. It did not optimize for maximum efficiency, but for the ability not to collapse. Another often overlooked point is that the medieval household did not clearly separate economic activity from daily life. Labor was not a distinct part of the day. It was the structure of the day. Children grew up in environments where work, eating, rest, and learning occurred in the same space, governed by the same logic. This created continuity across generations. Skills were not taught through formal instruction, but through direct participation. How to dry grain properly, how to recognize the smell of food beginning to spoil, how to divide rations during difficult weeks. These were absorbed naturally, long before individuals were old enough to question them. The household thus became a repository of survival knowledge, not academic knowledge, but practical knowledge, tightly bound to the specific conditions of each region, climate, and risk profile. No two households operated in exactly the same way, but all shared one defining feature. Every function converged in a single place. This convergence made the medieval household both resilient and fragile. Resilient because it did not depend on external systems. When markets fluctuated, when wars disrupted trade, when transport failed, the household could continue to exist for a period of time, as long as stores remained sufficient and discipline held. But fragile because when this system failed, there was no second layer of protection, no insurance, no immediate relief. A sequence of adverse events, bad weather, illness, misallocation, could result in total collapse. This explains why medieval societies were often cautious toward risk, not because they lacked ambition, but because they understood the cost of failure. When recovery is slow or impossible, the rational strategy is to avoid pushing the system to its limits. The household therefore prioritized stability over growth. Small but reliable surplus was preferable to large but unstable gains. This logic stands in direct contrast to many modern models, where risk is distributed and consequences are often delayed. One critical point must be emphasized. Within this system, people were not treated as independent individuals, but as components of a whole. A person's value was closely tied to their role within the system. This did not necessarily produce happiness in the modern sense, but it produced clarity. Everyone knew what was expected of them. Every action had a concrete rationale, and every decision was evaluated by a single criterion. Did it help the household continue to exist? This clarity allowed the system to function under prolonged scarcity. When survival was the sole objective, secondary conflicts tended to recede. From a modern perspective, it is easy to judge the medieval household as harsh, restrictive of personal freedom, and inflexible. But it is essential to remember that this model was not designed to maximize choice. It was designed to endure a world defined by uncertainty. And within that endurance, a paradox emerges. Medieval households, despite material scarcity, possessed something that many modern families are gradually losing: functional cohesion. Each person understood that their survival was directly linked to the survival of others. When such a system operates across generations, it produces a form of deep stability, not the stability of comfort, but the stability of structure. A structure strong enough to withstand prolonged strain without immediately collapsing. Conclusion: in the modern world, extended supply chains, massive storage systems, and global markets have blurred this relationship. We can consume far beyond our immediate needs without seeing the consequences right away. We can waste without directly confronting the cost. And as a result, much of contemporary consumption exists in a state of delayed or muted feedback. This is not because modern people are more irresponsible. It is because the system itself is designed to absorb and conceal consequences. What is striking is that when this system is disrupted by crisis, natural disaster, pandemic, or conflict, very old questions immediately return. How much food is left? Who will be prioritized? And how long can we hold on? These are not questions born of modern panic. They are the same questions medieval households had to answer every year for centuries. And perhaps the most important lesson we can learn from them does not lie in techniques like salting meat or fermenting vegetables. It lies in how they understood food itself. When that understanding is no longer embedded in daily life, we gain convenience. But we also give up a deeper awareness of limits, of interdependence, and of long-term responsibility. We do not need to return to living like medieval families, but in a world that is becoming increasingly complex and fragile. Understanding how they survived is not a luxury, because history does more than tell us what happened. It quietly reminds us that every system, no matter how advanced, exists only as long as its foundations are respected. And sometimes, the best way to understand what we are standing on today is to look back at a time when a single mistake at the dinner table could alter the fate of an entire household. If these analyses have helped you see familiar things in a different light, feel free to share your thoughts below the video. A detail that surprised you, a point you had never considered before, or simply a question you would like to explore further. Because beneath the apparent simplicity of modern life, there are still many invisible structures at work, and we are often more dependent on them than we realize. If you would like to continue this journey in future videos, you can like the video and subscribe to the channel. We will keep returning to history not to admire it or judge it, but to understand how people lived, endured, and survived through things that seem ordinary until they are no longer. I will see you in the next video.